Hello and good afternoon. I would like to welcome everyone to today's webinar, Understanding the Role of Hiring Managers in the Immigration Process. Before we begin the presentation, I would just like to go through a few brief housekeeping items. Today's session will be about 45 minutes long, including an audience Q&A at the end of the presentation. This webinar is being recorded and we will send you a link to download the recording after today's live session. We also encourage you to ask questions throughout the presentation. To do so, please use the question function that you see on the right-hand side of your screen. Also, just a note that today's webinar is being conducted remotely, and while we don't anticipate any disturbances, please excuse any audio-visual issues that you might experience during the broadcast. So for those of you who aren't familiar, for nearly 20 years, Envoy has been on a mission to fix the inefficient, frustrating, and confusing immigration process. We combine a top-ranked legal team with innovative technology to deliver the only platform that makes it seamless for companies to hire, mobilize, and manage a global workforce. We secure work authorization in over 150 countries. We've grown 37% year over year, and we work with over 1,000 customers. We are particularly proud of our NPS score, which is a testament to the employee experience that we provide. And before we begin, I'd also just like to take a moment to welcome today's presenter, Jacqueline Petit of Global Immigration Associates. Jacqueline is a senior associate at Global Immigration Associates, where she counsels clients in several industries on employment-based, non-immigrant, and immigrant visa matters, including H-1B, L1, TN, E, and O1 non-immigrant petitions in both PERM and EB1 green card cases. Jacqueline also provides strategic guidance on DOL compliance matters and the effects of corporate restructuring, mergers and acquisitions, and layoffs on foreign national employees. Prior to joining Envoy, Jacqueline worked as a prosecutor with the City of Chicago Department of Law, where she gained extensive administrative law experience. Thanks for joining us, Jacqueline.
Thanks for having me, Nidhi.
Awesome, great. So just to run through today's agenda, we'll start by discussing the importance of employee experience in today's environment. We'll then jump into a discussion of some of the various roles that hiring managers play during different immigration processes, followed by some helpful practice pointers for improving communication between HR teams and hiring managers. And then we'll finish up, like I said, by taking some questions from the audience before we conclude the session. And just a last quick note before we begin, that the content in this presentation is not intended as legal advice, nor should it be relied on as such. For any additional information on the issues discussed, please consult with your immigration counsel. So it's well known that for foreign national employees, employee experience does matter during the immigration process. Immigration can naturally be anxiety-inducing for foreign nationals going through it. With the current environment, these anxieties are even more heightened. Things like processing delays, travel restrictions, and tightening immigration policies are making it an even more uncertain time to be going through immigration. In fact, Envoy recently conducted a survey to better understand how global mobility and immigration professionals are adapting to managing remote immigration programs. And what we found is that nearly all respondents have reported an increased number of questions from foreign nationals about remaining in status, travel, green card applications, and more. So in light of this, Jacqueline, could you explain a little more about the role that generally hiring managers play in both immigration and the employee experience?
Yes, so hiring foreign national workers, in addition to working with them on goals, performance, career development, there's also many other factors to take into consideration for hiring managers. As Nidhi pointed out, the immigration process can be long, complex, and anxiety-inducing. And requires cooperation between recruiters, hiring managers, HR teams, the foreign national worker, and an immigration service provider to set expectations, track and plan for additional steps that may be may need to be taken to keep the foreign national employee in valid status and work authorized, and to just, settle some of that anxiety the foreign national goes through. I'll use an example of how the hiring manager comes into play with hiring an H-1B worker and continuing to employ an H-1B worker, as that's typically the most common non-immigrant visa. So, for example, when hiring an H-1B worker who's changing employers, employed by another employer in H-1B status, it's beneficial to set expectations for the hiring manager and recruiters and the foreign national regarding their start date, as a petition has to be filed with USCIS before they can start with a new employer. Setting those expectations can settle a lot of those concerns and anxieties. Managers may need to work on a more detailed job description to make sure that a strong case is presented to USCIS to show that the individual qualifies for H-1B status in a specialty occupation. If a request for evidence is issued during the process, the hiring manager may need to work together additional documentation regarding the role, potentially examples of other people employed in the position. Once the person is onboarded and their H-1B is approved, that authorization is only approved up to a 3-year increment. So expiration dates need to be tracked so that extensions are timely filed. Hiring managers need to be informed of what goes into the process, because, for H-1B, if there's change in job duties or if there's a transfer of work site, then information needs to be communicated to HR representatives and immigration service provider before that change occurs. We make sure the person remains in valid status and USCIS is notified if necessary. Additionally, there's a 6-year limitation in H-1B status. So those are things that need to be taken in consideration to time starting the green card process. Is that something the company wants to commit to for this employee? And, the hiring manager comes into all of those different steps to make sure, that everything's tracked properly, everything's communicated, and expectations and timelines are set to keep that employee in valid status and employed with the company.
Awesome. Thanks, Jacqueline. On that note, you touched on this a little, but let's take a closer look at the role of hiring managers and some common immigration workflows. So to start, Jacqueline, could you speak to some of the ways that hiring managers should be involved during H-1B cap season?
Yes, and believe it or not, as most people listening in are probably familiar with the H-1B cap. Just a brief overview, for any new H-1B applicants, there's a lottery every year for 65,000 new H-1B visas and an additional 20,000 reserved for U.S. master's degree holders or higher degree holders. Because USCIS receives more than 85,000 total applications per year, there's a lottery conducted. Believe it or not, it feels like we're still working on this year's cap, but it is, time for companies to start thinking about next year's H-1B cap season, to plan out which employees might require H-1B sponsorship, review budgets, review backup plans and timelines for those not selected. And hiring managers play a key role in this process. First, they are usually the first that are able to identify employees who are eligible for or require or could benefit from an H-1B visa. These employees on their team may include, but they're not limited to, F1 students. F1 students, have a limit to the amount of work authorization they gain while they're in F1 status. Typically after completion of their degree program, they're eligible for 12 months of OPT, and then if they complete a STEM degree, they may be eligible for an additional 24 months. After this is exhausted, there can be limited options for maintaining work authorized status in the U.S., and H-1B is typically the most desired route. So, most F1 students are going to be looking to be sponsored in the H-1B cap. L1 visa holders, could benefit from changing to H1 status if they aren't qualified for an EB1, multinational manager green card, or if they're from a country that has a long wait for green card availability, because L1 has a limitation, L1B has a 5-year limitation, L1A has a 7-year limitation, and those in the H1B or in L1 can't extend beyond that limitation, even if they reach a certain stage of the green card process. While in H1B, there's a 6-year limitation, but that can be extended if someone has an I-140 approval through the green card process. So that could strategically be a good idea for some L workers. E or TN and other non-dual intent categories. Not being dual intent means they're not supposed to have the intent to become a permanent resident. While it's possible to adjust status from these not dual intent categories, it is far more complicated and adds an element of additional risk. So those in a non-dual intent status may, if they want to, become a permanent resident, ultimately, they may benefit from changing to H1B status if they qualify. And then also dependent visa holders like H4 spouses or L2 spouses of H and L visa holders who have an EAD card, they may benefit from changing to H1B status if they qualify, because the EAD has a limitation, is dependent on the spouse maintaining their H1B or L1 work authorization. And then, sometimes you can experience gaps in work authorization if the EAD card is not renewed timely. So they can sometimes benefit if they qualify. Again, this is not an exhaustive list, but these are things that, can be taken into consideration when identifying employees eligible for the cap on a hiring manager's team. Also, hiring managers can be involved in determining timelines for, starting work in the H-1B cap. So we went over F1 students. F1 students with OPT or STEM OPT work authorization can start working for the employer if they're authorized by their school while they have that work authorization. But they need to the company would need to evaluate, how much time do they have left on their OPT or STEM OPT. We always recommend companies register someone in the H-1B cap as early as possible. So even if they're on their first 12 months of OPT and are eligible for a STEM extension, it's beneficial to enter them into the H-1B cap at the first available date, because it is a true lottery. So if they're not selected, then we want to utilize, extra time in the coming years when they would still have OPT work authorization, so that they have extra chances in the cap before they exhaust that OPT. And making sure that the candidate and the manager understand the timing of the lottery is also important. There's many dates and milestones we go through in the H-1B cap process. It's important to just communicate that to them so they know when registration occurs, when documents need to be gathered, if selection occurs, when the petition needs to be filed, when we might get approval, and things like that. It's important for them to be aware of these processes and timelines so that there's not more frustration created through this complicated and already frustrating process. Another thing, we've mentioned limitations in status. Hiring managers should be involved in identifying at-risk employees early on in the process, and working with the company to determine whether they might be at risk with losing work authorization if they're not selected in the lottery this year, and what alternatives may be available. So if they determine, someone is exhausting their 24 months of STEM OPT, in the summer of 2021, and it's their last chance to be entered in the H-1B lottery this year, there would need to be discussions about what alternatives there might be if the person is not selected, because again, it is a true lottery and there's no guarantee of selection. I think there was around a 40-something% selection rate this year, which is higher than years past, but there is no guarantee. So things to be considered are, is there an office abroad that the individual might be able to be relocated to keep them inside the company if they're not selected, if there's no alternatives for work authorization in the US. Does the manager know or understand the L1 intercompany transfer process? If someone's relocated to an entity abroad, there's a possibility they could be brought back after at least a year in L1A or L1B status if they qualify. Is there potential for an alternative visa for this individual? For example, if they're Canadian or Australian, there might be a nationality-based visa available for them as an alternative to H-1B. Is the employee interested in continuing education and continuing their F1 status, enrolling in another degree program, which may allow them continued work authorization? Those are all things that should be discussed in preparing for the H-1B CAP process, and hiring managers can, take a big role in that so that they're informed if they might lose a member on their team or have to come up with alternatives if they're not selected in the lottery. It's also important to keep managers updated on milestones that we kind of touched on, because it is, a complicated process. There's many steps involved. There's a registration process that will open up in March. The lotteries run from those online registrations. Then if they're selected, a petition needs to be filed. Once a petition's filed, there could be, an approval, or there could be a request for evidence. Or requests for evidence are received, the hiring manager might need to be looped in to provide additional information about the role. Once the CAP petition is approved, they should be updated, so they know, when the person's status changes, what the expiration date is for that status, if any other action needs to be taken, and when that needs to be taken. And then obviously in the event the petition is not approved, alternatives would need to be discussed as well. It's really important for HR and the immigration team and the employee and the hiring manager to all be looped in on these dates and important milestones, so that there's no surprises or additional frustrations during the process.
Thanks, Jacqueline. On that note, another area where hiring managers actually do play a pretty big role is the PERM recruitment and green card application process. Jacqueline, could you speak a little more about that?
Yeah, the manager plays a very important role through the green card process for a foreign national employee. So it's very important that the manager understands that role. For the PERM process, the manager needs to determine the role that the foreign national employee will be sponsored for. That could be their current role, it could be a future role that's more advanced that they see them moving into by the time they receive their green card, because it is an offer of future employment. The manager has to present the job description for this role, outlining the detailed duties and the minimum requirements for entry into the role, highlighting any special skills, tools, technologies that are required for someone who would be entering the role with the company, because those are very important to have in the job description to advertise during the recruitment process and evaluate any U.S. workers who may apply to the role against those requirements. And then the foreign national employee being sponsored also has to be able to demonstrate that they possess that experience before being hired into the role or a similar role within the organization. So it's beneficial to have a PERM conference, or meeting between the employee and the manager to discuss the position and the requirements. We can go to the next slide. We find there's often a disconnect between what the manager deems as the minimum requirements for the role and the employee's qualifications. In the PERM process, we want to outline what the true minimum requirements are. And obviously, if the person being sponsored for the role didn't possess those requirements before being hired, those aren't the true minimum requirements. So this kind of meeting between the immigration team, the manager, and the employee can help kind of clear up any process gap and keep the process in motion. The PERM process is not the most logical process because, you're presenting this role that the foreign national is already performing or largely performs within the organization, but advertising it as if it's a new role to recruit for this job opening that's not really open. So it can be a very complicated process. It can be, seem a little illogical to a hiring manager. So having a meeting and discussing the process and the steps and why we're asking for certain details about the job description can be extremely helpful and avoid a lot of frustration through the process. Again, the role during the PERM process, it's important for the HR team to consult with the managers so that they don't make any promises to an employee before checking, with that team, if the company has an immigration policy, if in that policy you have a certain, timeline for starting the green card process with employees, that should be, shared with hiring managers so they know, the company won't consider sponsorship within, until the employee's been there for 1 year or, whatever the policy may be. There's no legal restrictions on starting the process within a certain period of employment, but a lot of companies have policies in place about when the company will consider starting the sponsorship because of review cycles or things like that. So it's important that the hiring managers are aware of those policies. So again, there's no frustration caused by hiring managers maybe promising a candidate or an employee, something that's not offered to other employees. Again, when you start the PERM process, it's important to meet with the manager early on to provide a high-level overview. I find that's been extremely helpful with many PERM processes to get a meeting up front just to go over all the steps, go over why certain things are happening and what timeline is to be expected as it eases concerns for everybody involved.
Awesome. Thanks, Jacqueline. And so then there's obviously outside of H-1B cap season and, PERM recruitment and green card applications, there's other immigration related matters. Jacqueline, could you share some best practices on some other immigration processes?
Yeah, so especially in recruiting foreign nationals and, new candidates who are being onboarded for the company, explaining timelines and risks involved with different visa processes to to hiring managers and even recruiters to avoid frustrations is a great best practice. Just making sure managers are aware of what goes into sponsoring a foreign national employee to avoid frustrations. I've seen frustrations caused when, there's not an understanding with the hiring manager about, what goes into the process and what limitations there might be on a start date. So just making hiring managers aware, if you're hiring someone who requires sponsorship, there may be a delay in the start date due to things outside of their control. for an H-1B worker, I gave the example, they could start legally once the petition's filed. Some companies might have a policy where they want to wait for approval. There's other visa types that might require approval of the visa before they can start with the employer, which can be not as easy to predict as USCIS processing times vary. So it's just very important to make them aware of generally what goes into sponsoring a foreign national worker. As a candidate who requires sponsorship likely won't be able to start within 2 weeks of accepting an offer. And then, just setting expectations, again, can avoid a lot of the frustrations for both, the managers and their team and, the foreign national employees being onboarded and retained once they're onboarded. Again, as stressed through here, communication is key. Face-to-face or virtual meetings can help add an element of humanism to the immigration process, allows your immigration team to build a relationship with the hiring managers and trust with the hiring manager. And we'll kind of get into that on the next slide as well.
Yeah, actually, so obviously we've talked a lot about how important really communication is during the whole process. And, these days, with remote work, it's sometimes not as easy to get face-to-face with others at an organization. But with that being said, there are still plenty of ways to keep information flowing to who it needs to be going to. Jacqueline, what are some strategies that can work for HR teams to improve that line of communications with hiring managers?
Yes, we kind of have touched on a little bit on previous slides. Again, face-to-face meetings or virtual meetings can be very beneficial. Kickoff meetings once an offer is made to meet with the manager and other partners, assign a point of contact, determine information storage, provide facts, projected trajectories, just to go set expectations for what the process will look like to get them onboarded and who they'll be working with as far as an immigration services provider. Virtual town halls to educate recruiters or hiring managers, provide education on best practices, immigration trends, things to look out for when onboarding foreign nationals or hiring foreign nationals. Newsletters can be helpful to send to hiring managers and employees highlighting relevant information, changes to legislation or new trends in immigration or changes, travel restrictions, especially now with COVID-19 related travel restrictions. There's constantly new updates about exemptions from these travel restrictions, and we're not sure if moving forward there could be additional restrictions as we get into the colder months. So newsletters with updates about these trends can be helpful for both hiring managers and employees, recruiters, and HR. Manager toolkits and intranet resources to provide, access to managers for, FAQs about certain visa types and timelines and things like that can be very helpful, just to, again, set expectations and have these resources available for education for managers who might, hire foreign national talent regularly on their teams. So those can all be, helpful in improving communication and education for hiring managers on, the immigration process.
Thanks, Jacqueline. And that brings us to our audience Q&A section. Jacqueline, before we open it up for questions, did you have any final remarks you wanted to make?
No, not really. Again, I stress communication is key here, and just setting expectations for hiring managers. I think in my experience, I find a lot of managers within organizations who have more national talent on their team are not, sometimes they're not well informed about what goes into the immigration process. And companies who have a good internal education program for their hiring managers and do refreshers, once or twice a year about immigration trends, tend to see less frustration with their, internally with their hiring managers and also with their retention of their foreign national employees. So it can be very helpful just to keep, education and communication flowing and constantly updated, at least yearly, with those hiring managers, just to go over, those trends and changes in immigration policy or what might impact the foreign national employees already employed.
Awesome. Thanks so much for that. So yeah, that brings us to the audience Q&A portion. As a reminder, to ask questions, you can use the question function that you see on the right-hand side of the screen. Also, just as a reminder, we cannot answer any specific questions about cases. For any case-specific questions, please consult your immigration counsel. And please bear with us. Some of these questions we just have to screen through, but it looks like we have gotten a few that came in. So Jacqueline, this first one is asking, could you give some more context on timelines for starting work for CAP exempt employers?
Yeah, I can give a general overview about that. So if a CAP exempt employer, so this is usually a nonprofit research organization. I'm not going to go through all the regulations, but if the employer is CAP exempt, they could hire a person in H-1B status without having them first go through the CAP lottery. And this could be a person who's never held H-1B status before. So if that person is changing status, so if they're a student and they're being hired by a CAP exempt employer, they don't have to go through the CAP lottery, but they would not be able to start employment with the employer in H-1B status until a petition is approved by USCIS, because it would be a change of status. So if they were already working while on OPT, there probably wouldn't be any gap in work authorization, depending on the situation, but they wouldn't be able to start until approval of the petition. So usually, if they were changing, well, I'll give an example. If they were changing status if they didn't have work authorization in that prior status, usually it would take, at least 2 weeks to prepare the petition, because there's an LCA filing. So once filed with USCIS, if premium processing is utilized, there would be another at least 15 days before you would receive any decision from USCIS. So it would be at least a month from initiating the process, would be the first possible, start date. If premium processing is not utilized, then there's varying processing times at service centers, so that could be several months. And then if a request for evidence is issued, it can delay the process for up to about 3 months. So there's no concrete timeline, but it would be, I usually say it's probably at least 5 weeks after the case is, opened with the immigration provider, to get the person started.
Awesome. Thank you for that.
Answers the question vaguely, but
yeah, so we had another good one come in. A lot of times managers come back with questions on some guidelines on the documents or a response to RFEs. How do we help them with this, especially if one is new to the process?
Well, if you're working with an immigration provider, it's, you can ask for clarification on certain documents. Again, it's always going to be specific to the particular RFE. Some are pretty standard requests, some get very specific. So that one's a tough one to answer just because it's going to be dependent on the specific guidelines, or the specific RFE request. But if you are finding managers need more clarification on what's required, then I would just communicate that to the immigration provider, the paralegal team or the attorney on the case, just to tell them we need more specific guidance, because those who don't have as much experience obviously are going to need a little more hand-holding through the process, while others who have been through it many times before don't need much guidance. So again, communication with the immigration services provider just to provide more specific direction if you're running into a situation with a manager who hasn't been through the process before, could be helpful. Personally, awesome. I work with some companies who they have hiring managers who've been through this a lot, so I know I can just send them the request and they'll go with it, go from there. And others I know need more specific, detailed instruction about what exactly I'm trying to get at. But again, education about specifically for H-1Bs, about what's a specialty occupation, and what goes into sponsoring the worker, as we went through in the presentation, just setting up kind of education for hiring managers once a year or something, just to go through that can also usually resolve some of those questions when they end up having to deal with an RFE themselves.
Awesome. Thanks, Jacqueline. One more here. How and when should you notify a hiring manager that a candidate needs sponsorship? How much can you tell them?
So, well, this one gets in a little bit of employment law, so I can't really get very specific here because some states have more restrictive discrimination laws. But I mean, once the offer has been made and accepted, you can let the hiring manager know that we have to sponsor this individual, so this might delay the timeline. So yeah, you can let them know they need to be sponsored for this type of visa. And here's the timeline. That's all I really can get into here. But they can be made aware that this person accepted the offer. We discovered they require sponsorship. And this is the potential timeline and roadblocks we could run into.
Got it. Great. Last question here, just in the interest of time, but this is a more general one. Do you have any idea when travel restrictions will be lifted to allow hired employees from foreign countries to come to the U.S.?
We do not. The presidential proclamation that's restricting entry for H-1B, L, and J individuals is expected to go through at least the end of the year. Right now it's still until at least December 31st, 2020. The other COVID-related travel restrictions for travel from China, Brazil, Iran, UK, Ireland, the Schengen area, those don't have a specific end date. So we do not know at this time. I suspect the results of the election could, result in some changes. So we don't know. It's an election year, so I think a lot of things are up in the air, but I would expect most of these restrictions to continue until the end of the year. If
awesome.
not long, and could be extended.
Great, thanks so much. That does bring us to the end of our webinar, but before we go, I would just like to highlight a couple of upcoming webinars. Next week, we'll be taking a look at the e-treaty visas. And on that Thursday, we will also be having an immigration policy discussion with Global Immigration Associates about some of the policy updates we've seen and what some of their broader ramifications could be. I'd also just like to remind you all to follow Envoy on social media, especially if you're interested in getting updates on travel restrictions, policy changes, news, and trends to help you navigate the current rapidly changing immigration landscape. We do frequently update our blog with new best practices, policy updates, and other news. So be sure you're following us to get all of that great information. As a reminder, attendees will receive a recording of this webinar along with the slide deck and the SHRM and HCRI educational credits in an email tomorrow. And we'd just like to thank you all for attending today's webinar. And Jacqueline, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you.
Absolutely. Goodbye, everyone. Hope you have a wonderful afternoon.